Welcome back, Equity Warriors, and thanks for tuning in to this special episode. My guest today is the founder and executive director of See Beyond Educational Consulting in Los Angeles. A native of Shreveport, Louisiana, she grew up in LA, graduating from the famed Crenshaw High School. She received her BA from Howard University and fellowshipped her way through an MA in Columbia University. In high school, she won the school's first ever academic decathlon for speech. During her senior year at Howard, she received first place in oral interpretation for the National Individual Events Tournament. She is noted to be not only the first woman, but also the first African American to do so. For the last 25 years, Florence has served as an educator at Crenshaw High School, as well as at juvenile halls and camps for the Los Angeles County Office of Education. In addition to holding certifications as a literacy specialist, educational specialist, and ethnic studies educator, she is believed to be the only educator who also holds a certification as a gang intervention specialist. It is my honor to welcome California's 2012 Teacher of the Year, Florence Avignon. Welcome to the show, my friend.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure and an honor to be here.
All right. Okay. So when I read your bio, quick personal connection here, I want to touch on that speech and debate thing, because as a child, I was terrified, mortified to speak in public. And I don't mean like standing up and doing a speech. I mean, even standing in front of my class to read out loud. And I was a good reader. So it wasn't that I had reading issues.
Yes.
In college, in the UC University of California system, you have to take a public speaking course in order to graduate. It was the last class. I put it off as long as I could. And then I took it in summer session because I wanted the torture to be as short as possible. But I would literally be physically ill starting the night before any time I was going to have to stand up and speak in class. So I think I literally barfed my way through that class. So how did you get into speech and debate? And what words of wisdom would you give to young people of color on participating in speech and debate?
Well, I truly love literature, and I just loved sharing literature. I actually did a performance called Making Me Whole because I thought about I grew up, very impoverished, single mom, the food stamps and so forth. We had no car, so I read a lot. And so I would read these authors who were years older than I was, obviously, the Nikki Giovanni's, and I'm like, my gosh, they grew up almost like I did. So that's where that concept of Making Me Whole came from. But I loved sharing their works. So I love bringing the books to life. I just always love memorizing a good poem. I also adored Stevie Wonder, and we know he was a poet. So I just loved reciting literature. So it just became automatic. If I read something amazing, I recited it. And now as a literacy teacher and a speech coach for several years, the history of Brown and Black children is oral language because we could not write. They did not give us access to the reading. Much of our history was oral. So, and which is a whole nother conversation about literacy rates being so low for Brown and Black children when historically our ancestry was oral. So just falling in love with history and literature just made me feel as if I needed to celebrate the works of authors. I needed to share. It's a conversation. It's keeping history alive by sharing the works of poets and artists like like the Stevie Wonder lyrics. So I just really think it was my love for the literature and wanting to share it with other individuals.
So any advice for someone, maybe a little girl like I was, that's just petrified when you have to, shaking like a leaf, petrified when you've got to stand up and speak?
Yes. Well, I think that takes me back to my literacy background as an educator. You start small, and you tell the story. So the first thing I do, and I think that's part of that being culturally responsive with literature in the classroom, because when students find something that connects to them or images that connect to them, they become more comfortable, because part of the fear is not having a connection to what you're reading in those classrooms. Let's think about hip hop. That's primarily children of color who love to go around and recite those lyrics. So in my classrooms, I try to create spaces where there is literature that brings students to the library. And once they're brought to the library, if we begin in small circle with share your favorite poem, share your favorite excerpt from the novel, it becomes more of a space of community in your room, and people feel like they want to share what they enjoyed.
Well, that's interesting.
Yes.
And that resonates because when I found my voice, when I stopped being afraid to speak, it was because I was talking about something I was passionate about.
Absolutely.
And I think back to, in the late 60s, early 70s, when I was going, or through the 70s, when I was in K-12, that the literature that we were given, for the most part, did not have a connection to me culturally.
Yes.
So maybe that's it. I like that.
Yeah.
I like
and
that.
Actually, all those awards that I'm proud to have received while at Howard, while at Crenshaw, we specifically sought out African-American authors. And it was disproportionately white competitors in the room, but we made it a point of having the most eloquent introductions that were read in the King's English. And then we snap into the Langston Hughes dialect or the Paul Laurence dialect. And we did that intentionally to show that we can honor our history at the same time, meet the standards of public speaking.
Wow, I love that. We might have to do a whole second show at some point in time to talk about literature. You told me that besides being the parent of an awesome son, I am too, and today's his birthday, in fact.
Oh gosh, happy birthday, son.
Happy birthday, Stefan. Your other greatest achievement is motivating students to see beyond their challenges. And I like that. I saw that connection. So what exactly inspired you to start See Beyond Consulting?
The overwhelming conversations about the failure to transition children in justice-informed settings. And I have a very unique background, and I did mention that as much as in the intro. While I've served in those two capacities, traditional high school and juvenile court schools, I had 9 years in a drug rehab school, wow. Which is also considered a part of our juvenile court schools, but obviously very unique because it's a residential treatment facility. And there are probation youth who hadn't committed as many offenses, but the judge felt it was most appropriate to place them in a drug rehab. And obviously, you get the idea that you really have to engage and encourage those children because the decision to take those drugs are often brought on by so many traumatic events. Yeah. And so I think during that era, coupled with my experience in serving marginalized youth in traditional high schools, as well as juvenile court school students, it was really the fact that I realized many students could not imagine 5 years beyond their current standing. And I felt, because I witnessed so many fly beyond me and come back and say, I appreciate it, I needed to have other agencies know that the center of all their services is to help a child see beyond their adversity. Wow,
that is awesome. So you use the term justice-informed settings. Explain to our listeners what you mean by that.
So, and a part of those terms came from, I have to say, juvenile justice advocates who, and I truly believe, and I'm a really unique educator, do not believe that students should be inside. Issues that bring them to us, if we address them, they wouldn't be inside. So justice-informed settings are those youth who appear before a judge. We no longer say jailed or incarcerated. Right. It simply means that the students and their families and communities have been informed by a legal system that a student is to be placed within these settings.
Got it. Okay. New vocabulary term for me, justice informed. I will use that from now on. Thank you.
No problem.
So we met at an equity conference in San Diego, and I sat in your session on suspending students and analysis of inequities. The title caught me when I was looking at all the sessions, like, oh no, I'm headed there. And literally about 5 minutes in, and I was so glad I was sitting in the front row, I said, I need her to come on my podcast. So when it was done, I was ready to pounce. I became the presenter stalker. What would you like to share with our listeners about that topic?
Yes. And you know what? And I actually had to tell the organizers that it's actually called suspended students.
Okay.
And actually you're right. They posted it with just suspending students. But if you think of the title in its original form, you could sort of get the gist: suspending suspended students. Mm-hmm. And I'm talking about the fact that students sitting in justice-informed settings have had the ultimate suspension already. and still disproportionately within these settings, they're suspended.
So they're in what we would old school. We called it when I was in high school, it was a continuation school, right? Because you couldn't keep going.
Well, continuation school is really different from juvenile housing camps. Continuation schools are those students who've been out of school because they're in the public. The traditional high school might have a continuation school right next to it. That means that the kids are so far behind in credits, they've been truant, that in order for them to attempt to graduate, they are placed in a continuation school. That's in the public. But students that I serve have committed some kind of crime. And or they were in their traditional high schools and they committed an expulsory act, meaning that they brought drugs,
took a gun to school, brought drugs to school. So they've been expelled or they've committed a crime, and this is their placement.
This is their placement. They stand before the judge. And I must say, has me really heavy. When I began within these programs, it was thousands of kids in these settings. Now we're down to less than 1,000. It's a good thing because of the justice involved advocates, juvenile justice advocates, which I appreciate. My concern is we still have the same recidivism. So I worry where those kids are, or if they're getting what they need, or if they're just flowing into the adult system.
Okay. So are you telling me that LA County has less than 1,000 children in?
Yes. In justice informed settings. Yes.
Are you kidding me?
No, because so what's going on, and a part of this, and every time I utter his name, I say a prayer to that family, but a part of it is the life of George Floyd, really pressing on the issue of inequities and diversion programs and mental health issues. So what counties are doing are creating diversion programs, which means that a kid might have, so the kids that within our settings, I have to say, are more than likely in our settings because their crimes were way above the limit.
All right.
If we have them, and that's why it's even more challenging within our settings quite often, because the students who commit misdemeanors who would historically be in our settings, now they're referred to diversion programs. That call for defund the police, which a lot of folks took incorrectly, channeled in to give some of that money to community agencies to provide the appropriate interventions. We've reduced the criminality of arresting young girls for prostitution because we often see, and more likely, they're victims.
They're victims, yes.
So absolutely. They're not. So that they used to be a huge contention within our program. So that's why there's a reduction within our settings throughout the county, because the diversion programs, my only concern, and I think it's an important conversation, is the agencies who get the funding, which I truly appreciate. And I know many of them, because I also didn't even mention that I have a window of time in which I supervise nonprofits, but you wonder why there's such a recidivism rate. If those agencies are out there. All due respect, the kids should not be in here. The schools needed to do the things that would reduce the likelihood of them being in here. And so I'm happy of the reduced numbers, but I do also want to make sure that those children are not simply timing out and increasing the likelihood of more. I'd like to do that data. I love data, but I'd like to do that data to see if there's an increase of 18 and 19-year-olds now going into adult systems.
Wow. Yeah, that would be interesting.
Yes.
I'm not going to go down there because we could. I'm literally still stuck on the fact that LA County has that. LA County is huge for, most of us in the US know LA's a big city. It's the second largest city in America. LA Unified is the second largest school district in the country. And we're talking about LA County, not LAUSD. And part of the reason I am stuck at that number is because as part of my work, I've looked at the numbers, the population of students or enrollment of students in court and community, sort of broader term, but justice-informed settings across the state of California. And there are much smaller counties where the numbers are not that small.
Right. And I think that's because we have so much more progressive entities. But I have to say this, because I don't want to, and I actually have to do the data for the county. To be quite exact, it's about 500 because I actually do the data for the county. But this is what's important. Those students who have graduated from our system, they're still within our system, but they're housed within our programs in diversion programs.
Okay.
So they're receiving what are called career to college services, and they're still housed within the facilities. And because literally that just shifted because of, I think it was 2020, they passed the law where kids could no longer be tried as adults and wait within what were called compounds to move to the state facility. So they're still within our probation facilities. It's just the separate entity within the walls.
Okay. All right. I'm learning a lot here. I'm learning a lot, and I love to learn. So I want to talk, though, about your work as a gang intervention specialist. It was the first time I heard that term or read that term was in reading your bio. And I imagine then not only for my listeners who are educators, but others, parents, politicians that are listening to this may not be familiar as well. So tell us about that and what its relationship is to equity in education for children who might get caught in that school to prison pipeline.
Yes, yes. I have had a very fortunate and enlightening journey myself. In the mid-90s, or the 90s in general, LA was besieged by gang activity. It was all over. There was even a sort of celebration in the music of gang culture, which I think has had a long-lasting impact. I say that often. And so as a result, the city's response, one of the last things that happened that influenced the creation of these programs was a young girl was killed. I don't know if anyone remembers that story. It was a national story. The family was driving through a certain community. And again, we'd had a lot of gang violence occurring, a lot of shootings, but this young girl was killed in the midst of gang activity. And so the city said they had to do something. And so as a result, we had leaders specifically begin to work with law enforcement. We called it task force meetings, gang task force meetings to be explicit. So that was the district attorney's office. It was OJJDP, the Office of Juvenile Justice. And they met with city officials and some executive directors to decide what needed to be done. And they acknowledged that at some point, the only individuals who could really reach young people who were involved in gangs were individuals who had changed their life around. And that term today is used, individuals with lived experiences.
Yep.
And so as a result, the city sought to create prevention and intervention programs for gangs, to prevent young people from joining gangs and to intervene when we knew individuals were in gangs. And so I actually served as a senior manager for that during a window of being an educator. And I was actually the manager of the original contract to train former gang members to become gang intervention specialists. That's why I just have such a story to tell. So what that entailed was...
It's like, how many jobs do you have? I mean, really?
Well, I was at Crenshaw. And if you know the history of Crenshaw and gangs and... So someone asked me to serve as the school liaison to the program because the program was based out of middle schools. And nonprofit agencies had to identify designated middle schools in which they provide their services after school. So I was in charge of those contracts and making sure they understood how to work with the school, make sure that the appropriate services needed. And I must say this, that, and I know there's a political official going through a lot right now in the city of Los Angeles, but Mark Ridley Thomas was really the orchestrator of this because of his background as a teacher, his commitment to human services. He knew that nonprofits always competed for resources, so he mandated that they collaborate in order to become either a prevention program or an intervention program. So when these former gang members participated in the Pat Brown Institute, they were the very first to award gang intervention specialist certificates. It was 6 weeks of training. I think the trainer's name was Anthony Thigpen, if I'm remembering. He was a real active community activist and community organizer. He's passed away since then. But he was the trainer who, and all of these former gang-involved individuals who came from just wanting to give their heart, many of them had done things that they just felt they needed to do something. And because they'd done the work for free for years, just to sort of, it came out of the 92 uprising also, I don't want to be remiss. And they were the ones who helped orchestrate the truce. So it was only automatic that they'd be the first ones that we consider to be our city's first gang intervention specialist. So I sat right in those classrooms with them. And that's how it gave me I'm a history teacher, an English teacher, but going through those classes really connects content to community.
It sounds like something that probably should be, I was credentialed in California. Born and raised in Northern California, other end of the state.
Yes.
And we have, or they used to have, I'm an old dog now, a requirement, you have to renew your credentials. So you have to take certain courses. Yes. It almost seems like, in addition to mandating language acquisition as part of, really being able to serve in California, that there's an addendum to your credential for going through something like that gang intervention specialist training. Because we know that it really is, it's at those middle school years is where kids are starting to get recruited.
Yes.
And if we have more teachers trained to see that, understand it, and work to intervene, that is, particularly for our boys of color, just as valuable as reading intervention.
Absolutely.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And it was truly from a trauma-informed perspective. So, which is what I absolutely love. And it's important that the participants keep the conversation going, because it was sitting with those gentlemen that really, and since then, of course, I've brought them into the halls and camps as vendors, but it was so important that I, as an educator, connected to the choices that were made when these adults were 16 and 15. So your point is extremely valid. But again, it's totally isolated from the journey as a teacher right now. And so I take great pride in being a part of that first cohort. Now we've had several other trainings in the city, different programs that train in intervention, or it's called violence prevention work or trauma-informed approaches to intervention. You have to have some certification if you're a vendor and you're trying to provide those services now. Okay. So, yes.
I want to stay on that. I'm going to flip my question order around here because we're talking about teachers in the classroom. There's some controversy over representation in the classroom, specifically about Black and brown children having teachers that look like them. Yes. So my listeners know I like numbers, so I had to check this out. 65.4% of the K-12 students in LA County are Latinx. 7.3% are Black or African American. So we're talking roughly 73% Black and brown.
Yes.
But when we get to justice-informed settings, 69.14% are Latinx and 14.7% Black. So 83.84%, almost 84%. We're talking 10 points higher than their representation of the general population. For those people not doing mental math, because for me, it is still kind of early, but even earlier for you in the morning. Our Black students are represented in those justice-informed settings at twice their distribution in the traditional school population, which had me saying something that I try not to say on the podcast anymore.
Yes.
So do you see any connections between the regular or traditional school district leadership and expulsions and Black and brown children being expelled at higher rates out of systems where leadership doesn't reflect the demographic of the learners? For lack of a better way of saying this, are Black and brown kids being suspended and expelled more out of whiter systems than they are systems of color? And then how do you see representation? How do you see it playing a role in the court and community, justice-informed settings, schools, classroom?
Let me give you a little bit. We talked about this briefly before, but in our setting, in particular in LA County, African-American children represent nearly 40%. And
wait a minute. So we're going to keep the math. So 7% of the population
and traditional
40% in traditional population. And overall in LA County, Black folks are about 7-8% of the population.
Yes.
But 40%?
Yes. I literally just gave a presentation on this on Tuesday. And when we talk about, the system, first of all, we all know progressive movements are trying to say, stop the top-down approach. Mm-hmm. The system still has a top-down approach. We're trying to haggle to say, you need to know what's going on the front line. But if the top is still at the top, it's still dwindling down to us. And if the top, when I do my presentations, and I believe I said it in the suspended student presentation, but one thing that I truly believe is the problem with our schools in general is that when we integrated schools, we didn't integrate content. I keep saying that, and it's
Can I
huge.
can I address your language there?
Yes,
Because this
yes,
is something that really annoys me. We keep talking about, or it's often said that we integrated the schools. And I say, no,
right.
we didn't. We desegregated the schools.
Yes,
We moved the
yes,
molecules around, but we didn't teach them how to get along.
right,
And true
right,
integration means that we understand each other, that we're in a culture where we connect, and
right.
there is validation of everyone that's there. So we
Right.
moved the bodies, but we did not shift a mindset.
And you're absolutely right, because I think you're saying what I'm saying, because I'm saying that our mind shift when we know more. Our
Yeah.
mind shifts when we learn differently. Our relationships change when we know the representation of everyone at the table. And that's why I say we didn't change content,
No.
because those things would have, if children had opened books and seen, God, African Americans did this. And the image did not just have the suburban family, but it had a diverse look at families,
Mm-hmm.
and so that you're absolutely right. And what I'm saying is that that mindset didn't shift for the educator or the children, because what we were learning didn't integrate. What we
Yeah.
were learning was not culturally responsive. What we were learning was not multilingual and multi-content. You see what I'm saying? So
Mm-hmm.
I'm
Mm-hmm.
saying exactly what you're saying. And as a matter of fact, it continued to perpetuate this concept of superiority and inferiority in terms of what was taught in classrooms.
Yeah. Yeah.
There's a powerful book called Choosing to See. It's
Okay.
beautiful. It's beautifully written. And it talks about, and it's specifically about math inequity, but I take its concept to equate to the question you just asked me. Do we see who we're serving honestly? And when we see who we're serving, it comes with all of the stereotypes behind who we're serving so that we can better serve them. It is
Mm-hmm.
not that we believe in those stereotypes, but we know that these children are coming from those paths. And it gives us a notion of coming with an asset-based
Right.
approach.
Yeah.
And so I actually just created a program in one of the camps called Choosing to See after school based on that premise. But I think it's huge that there are no managers who look like me that often in our programs. So the decisions that are made in terms of changes to curriculum or how something might be delivered or which vendors come in. And
Mm-hmm.
all of this has a lot to do with it. Related to what you just said, I just did this study in 2021 about when there was the least amount of suspensions occurring. The
And
least, oh, it was amazing. The least amount of suspensions during a given day for 6 weeks was when community agencies were in the rooms with the teachers.
all right.
And community agencies are often people of color.
Yeah. Yeah.
So kids didn't want to leave then. Kids were engaged then.
Mm-hmm.
So my argument was that meant that often teachers didn't understand the needs of those kids. And perhaps we needed to, and at the time, our schools only allowed the community agencies to come in after lunch because that was the elective period. So I now went on a path to have agencies sit with teachers and actually embed their content. If you're teaching English, then let's get the CBO who does creative writing to work with you.
Right.
And then
If it
teachers know.
works in all other areas, I think particularly like special ed, they want to push in special ed. They want to push in intervention. Why
Yes,
not push in that same thing?
yes,
That just
yes,
makes sense. Why do you
yes,
segregate it out
yes,
and make it an elective?
yes,
It needs to be part of their regular, just
yes.
connected content.
Yes. And it's
In
huge
reaching
when you
kids.
talk about children seeing individuals who look like them, because the
Mhm.
reality is this country is still disproportionately white teachers. It really
Yeah.
is. When I won my,
87%.
yes,
87% of
yes,
elementary teachers are white women.
yes. So even when I won Teacher of the Year, I was the only African American. You know how big California is. But
Yeah.
so given that reality, think about the fact that those 87% of teachers did not get culturally responsive
Oh, no.
content. So then let's just face that reality. They don't know.
No.
Now, given the fact that they're getting federal money, it's my premise that why not place community agencies in partnership with these teachers so that even those teachers are learning?
I have an answer for that, but I'm not going to go there because we'd really be down a rabbit hole. Like I said, we definitely have to have another show together. The last several, I guess, it'll be more than the last several, but I recently released several episodes on disproportionality in suspensions and expulsions, policing in schools, all of that. And as I looked at the numbers and read reports of the behaviors, I was really pissed off at the blatant disproportionality of Black and Brown kids, and even kids with IEPs, special education students, being taken into custody, given a record, which means anytime that somebody's called about that child, that record's going to pop up for things that are normal developmental behaviors, things that should be handled in the classroom by the teacher, or
Yes.
at the very least through some restorative practices at the school site.
Yes.
What should we be doing?
Yes. I love this question. Well, so first of all, I have to point out that my data in regards to the representation of African-American children, I'm sure you already know, there's already a disproportionate amount of African-American children who are also special ed.
Right.
So when we talk about the percentage of special ed children within juvenile, that's a whole nother level.
Huge.
The traditional percentage is 12%. We're about 9 times that.
And the true rate of special ed, of cognitive impairment, is only about 2.5%.
Yes.
So if only 2.5% of our kids are truly cognitively impaired, why are 14 to 20% being referred? It's teaching.
Yes. Yes.
And it's not the kids.
Yes. Yes. So
it's what we're doing in the classroom.
Everybody's arguing that we need to improve PBIS and the restorative approach. Mm-hmm. And it's driving me crazy because as a student, what engaged me was an amazing teacher who knew their content in high school. That's what drew me in. You respected that teacher. You might even see yourself doing something in science or math. And it bothers me that people have moved away from assuming that Black and Brown children can be enamored by content, can fall in love with a vision of being a science. It bothers me because they're so relegated to saying, how do we keep them behaved? But
that's racism. There's not another word for it. That is racist behavior in our classrooms.
Absolutely. So what I have been on my new campaign to do, and I know I shared that in that, people keep ignoring the fact that PBIS does not work if all of the inventory is not intact. And one key element of inventory for PBIS is content expertise, which brings it back to the teacher. Don't get mad at the kid if once he's sitting down and his hands are folded, but you don't know your science. Don't get mad at the kid if now you got him all quiet and you're listening, but you don't know that history lesson. Mm-hmm. So it's huge for me. Right now, I have this wonderful thing going on at my site because I finally got teachers to create routines in the classroom. And I've been trying to do this. And that takes a lot mentally because veteran teachers want to be in charge. They don't want to lose control. And I keep telling them, you will love it. It's trust, even within these settings. No, we can't do that within the halls. I'm like, no, yes, you can. If we have all of these special ed students, if we have students with different levels of academic proficiency, you need to learn who they are and you need to make sure that they have a differentiated approach. And the longer they're sitting in one big circle or one big classroom, they have an audience. So don't give them an audience. You become their audience. So, and I say this because a lot of this is on what's happening in terms of teaching. It really is. And I know folks may not like to hear this, but people are giving testimonies now at my site because they tried it and it's working and they can breathe and they're discovering, well, that kid really couldn't even read. Well, that's why he didn't raise his hand to read. And that's why he used profanity when you pointed to him to read. So all these discoveries are being made. I've told them to create appointments in the class and have a big chart up and have the kid's name and an appointment and the kid knows you're going to see him. So they're not attention deficit. So all of these things are working for these teachers and it's taken a while, but a lot of it is not knowing who you're serving culturally or academically. And what business has that happen? Even in business, you do a customer profile to know. Right. And I see teaching as I'm trying to sell you history. I'm trying to sell you English. I need to know which customers are in the room.
Exactly.
Yes.
Exactly.
Yes. Yes.
Oh, okay. I'm going to take us to a very specific population of marginalized learners, and it's one that I think doesn't get talked about enough, and that is foster youth. So
Yes.
when you look at California as a whole, I will say that they have uniquely addressed almost, I think, every category of marginalized learners. They've done it
Yes.
sooner than most states have done it. They have done it strategically with legislation, and they have targeted groups using their funding formula. And frankly, I think California has the most equitable funding formula in the nation. Of course, if I'm off, if I'm wrong, somebody's going to write in and try and correct the record, and we'll address that when that happens. But I want us to talk about AB 167/216.
Yes.
And that's the piece of legislation that addresses high school graduation for foster youth. So tell us about that legislation and how that provides equity for foster youth. And tell us why this is such a special group.
Yes. First of all, I would be remiss not to point out that we often have anywhere from 60 to 70% of foster youth in justice and justice informed settings. So, yeah, I mean, and yes, I have to say that students are often picked up homeless, or they were displaced, they were discharged, end up in a space of independent living or wherever. And if they're not, and I have to say this, when we talk about foster care and group homes, providers within these facilities have to change their hat from just being employees, because there's too many kids who end up not feeling a connection even within those facilities. And I'm actually doing a presentation later this month, and it's all foster youth directors and people who run those facilities. But I have to say, wherever we are, serving children is a human service. So you have to make sure the individuals understand humanity and understand the need to be culturally responsive. So AB 216 was done with the most amazing intent, because so many children were coming into our spaces after being in several foster homes, had missed several years of school. And the idea was, it wasn't fair that these kids were about to turn 18, or they came into our space at 18 and they had to do the traditional 220 credits to graduate. So what it did was remove the electives and give the option of just doing their core classes. And that expedited the opportunity to get their diploma, which I truly understand the intent, because who wants to be 19 still doing ninth grade classes?
Right.
The problem I'm finding as both an educational specialist and a literacy specialist is that prevented children from getting reading classes, which are electives. And so I'm not bad-mouthing it, but I think it needs to have some amendments to mandate a certain reading level, to mandate, because again, that just adds to the school to prison pipeline.
Yeah.
Because these kids are excited that, oh gosh, I can graduate now. I only need 130 credits. At least that's
But I'm graduating and I can't read my diploma.
Exactly. And if we don't have a caveat that says, but the child has to do this, or there's no initial, so I'm running around saying, wait, the kid can't read, but there's no clear mandate that the kid had to have a certain reading score. So I just think that's important as I sit here to advocate for kids. And I do understand its importance. I can think of a real story of a kid who absolutely loved, I was also a READ 180 teacher at the rehab. And the kid loved my class. He was finally notified because he was 18 that he didn't need to do all the credits. So they pulled him out of my class. And as a result, placed him in a regular ELA class. That kid stood at my door and refused to go into the class. And we had to sit and explain why, and I welcomed him coming after school for me to help him with his regular ELA class. And even if that's the amendment, that they have to do expanded learning to ensure that when they graduate, they can read or do math. Because we're creating the same old school to prison pipeline without these conversations.
Yeah. I mean, at least reading at an eighth grade level. I mean, we've got Lexiles. Let's put a Lexile on it. They have to be reading at a certain Lexile. Let's look at what trade jobs require in terms of reading, the ability to read at what Lexile our trade manuals written. Rather than just saying, okay, we're going to graduate you. You won't be able to read, you won't be able to calculate, but you will have a high school diploma. So
exactly. Because we all know the percentage, because I had to do that research. There's a large percentage of illiterate adult in jail.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
So then we have to start connecting what we're doing and how that looks beyond. We have to start connecting those things. And again, I appreciate the spirit and the intention behind it. But now let's look at how it's working. Let's look at its impact. And that's another thing. Laws are passed, but rarely does anyone go back and debrief it. And I know this because I had a conversation about this, and the lobbyists indicated it was difficult for them to now go back and lobby against it because they had lobbied for its passage. And I get it, but if you can have a quiet conversation with the individuals that you lobbied to see if they could reconsider to amend it,
Yeah,
So.
yeah. I know I told you to do this, but now I need to tell you to do that to this,
Yes,
or to do
yes,
this to that.
yes.
Oh goodness, we have to have a feel-good story before we close, because that's a lot. It's been a enlightening but weighty conversation.
Yes.
So I know as educators, especially those of us who've taught at the classroom level, we always have stories of students that stick with us, that make us smile. As I'm thinking about 3 or 4 in my head right now.
Yes.
You told me about a very special student who honored you in a special way. So please share that story with us.
Yes. I'm going to start off with this concept of serving the students who struggle the most, because right now in the state of California, African-American students are struggling the most. And the initiative is, if you target that population, all students benefit, because whatever strategies you come up with to improve their academic achievement, everyone benefits. And I say that as a precursor because this young man, David Flores, and I know he won't mind me saying his name, came to me after spending several years in foster care placement, because Mexican-American child, and both moms and dad had mom first because she had a drug issue, and then dad had eventually abandoned him, and he was left to the system and raised in the system by primarily African-American guardians and parents. And I met him at a time where his primary guardian, an African-American woman, passed away. And so, of course, he was going through a lot, and it was manifested in his daily life in high school. So as a result, he was moved from his high school and moved to Crenshaw when I was at Crenshaw. And he sat in the midst of mainly African-American children. And because my classroom is always a village, always there's more alike than different, always let me hear your voice, and yes, you'll have choice. And I have this tendency to call students my love. That's a Southern tendency. Yes, my love. Yeah. And you told me 20 something years later, that's what made him feel a part of the village. But his story is that he finished from Crenshaw, found new friends at Crenshaw, found himself a part of a village at Crenshaw, got into some other trouble when he left. I ended up advocating for him. And it was a decision he made based on someone else. He ends up meeting the father who abandoned him, ends up going to UCLA, graduating magna cum laude, doing his master's thesis on resilience while volunteering in my justice-informed setting, using my kids as the examples of resilience. And now he works at UCLA. And
wow.
So I share that story. And the big one, I had no idea, and does a TED Talk and features me.
That is amazing.
Yeah,
that is amazing.
Really proud of him. Really
awesome.
Proud of him.
David Flores.
Yes.
David, I hope you're listening. All right. I think I told you this. We could talk for 2 hours, but I'd lose all my listeners. We don't want to do that. We want them to stay engaged the whole time. So, I always sign off with a paraphrase of the great Dr. Angela Davis. And she said, I am no longer accepting the things I cannot change. I am changing the things I cannot accept. So my last question to you is, what is the thing you cannot accept? And what can my listeners do to support that change in their own communities?
Yes. I cannot accept that we cannot see that the children in our spaces are the wildest dreams of our ancestors, and that it is our responsibility to allow them to see beyond their adversity.
Wow. We can't top that. We cannot top that. But I have to ask, it's my last question. Yes. Is there a question I didn't ask you that you'd like to ask or answer?
No, I just want to make sure everyone understands content is huge. And we keep putting that on the back burner. It transforms lives when children see themselves in content. I just really want to leave that message.
We're going to come back to that in another episode. Just a reminder, folks, if you're hearing this for the first time on an audio podcast, these special episodes featuring everyday equity warriors doing amazing things will always be published as videos first on my YouTube channel. So if you're not subscribed to my YouTube channel, check down in the show notes for a link. Subscribe and then turn on those notifications so you'll know when the next interview has posted. And of course, share, spread the word. My guest today has been Florence Avignon, educator extraordinaire, founder and executive director of Beyond Educational Consulting in Los Angeles. And we'll put her contact information down in the notes as well. Florence, thank you for joining me. It has been what I knew would be a wonderful conversation.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
And to you equity warriors out there, if you or someone you know is an everyday equity warrior doing amazing things, let me know. We have more awesome and inspiring guests coming up, and maybe you or someone you know should be one of them. Remember to like, share, subscribe, and as always, don't worry about the things you cannot change. Change the things you can no longer accept. And I'll see you next time.